Hi, I just wanted to do this very quick introduction video to the presentation just to clear up some mistakes and inconsistencies on my part. The very first of which is right at the introduction. There is a slide that has an image of a piece of metalwork you can find in the manor, and I mistakenly attribute the zodiacal symbols on it for being fixed symbols where they are in fact cardinal symbols, so many apologies for that. The second of which happens about halfway through the presentation when one of the members of the audience asks a question about the priestess card that you can see in the Rider-Waite tarot card set. This is in comparison with the original Convert Marseille Papesse card and Wade's hybrid card that he creates using a combination of the imagery of both. The attendee asked about the Masonic connections to this card, of which is quite obvious because you've got the two pillars with the B and the J standing for Boaz and Yakin on that card. This is of course to do with the Golden Dawn, but at the time I froze up and completely forgot what the Golden Dawn was or what they did, so very many apologies. For context for the presentation, you don't really need to know what the Golden Dawn did, other than they were an influential magical organisation. Their full name was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. They were based on a Masonic structure but had very important and influential female members, which you don't really get in Masonry at that point in time. Aside from that, I hope it's not a bad presentation. I'm more used to introducing people for presentations rather than hosting them myself, so I do hope this is something I can get a bit better at doing. Again, thank you for your patience. I hope you enjoy this, and I very much hope to get back to Snowshill to do another one of these presentations in the future. Thank you very much. I would just like to say thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to everybody who's involved in running Snowshill and volunteering. It's a genuine pleasure, and I'd like to start by just thanking the spirits of the landscape and the spirits of Wade for enabling us to do this today, because without them we wouldn't be here. So yeah, so over to Charles Wade. Right, okay, so the title of this talk is Mystery is Most Valuable in Design, which I'm sure you'll recognise as a quote from Wade himself. So a bit of background to this: I've been writing a book for about 10 years now about the Witches Garret and about the Snowshill collection at the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. This talk will mostly focus on the Witches Garret and Wade's interest in the visual language of the occult. Two reasons for this. One, because I thought it would be most useful for the people here. The occult and magic is not a subject that gets treated with an awful lot of nuance in popular culture. And I imagine that from time to time you will be asked about with the Witches Garret. Oh, what was he doing up there? And I've got some good and some bad news in regards to that. So, but we'll preload with good news. We'll start optimistically. But throughout writing this book, I've not been able to talk to Wade or Cecil Williamson directly because they have passed away. So my main communication with them has been through their writing, and with Wade he left an awful lot of very excellent and very poetic writing, and maxims such as this have been a real guiding star. So that is the one thing I want you to hold in your mind when we're talking about anything to do with the either occult or religious imagery that you see around the house. So Mystery is Most Valuable in Design, Wade the Necromancer and the Occult Visual Culture of Snowshill Manor. Sorry. Okay, so it's talking three acts. There's some clumsy theatrical metaphors going on here. So we'll start big. We'll look at the overall context of the landscape that Snowshill inhabits, the Cotswolds. We'll start bringing it back into the manor, looking at the occult visual culture within the manor. And then we'll focus on Wade himself and the character of the necromancer that he embodied whilst he was here, before looking at the sometimes problematic legacy that left behind before concluding. So, don't know, do you recognise this symbol in the house? Yeah, it's a really wonderful little bit of metalwork. I think was made by Fred Hart, who was his mate that used to do the antiques runs with. It's a really, again, with Wade, there's so much going on with this. So you've got the fixed zodiac symbols of Aries, Cancer, Libra, and
Capricorn, thank you. And you've also got the Pax and the Crown of Thorns in there, so that's a real alchemical mix of things going on there. So let's start at the start. So Macrocosm, the Forest of Arden. It's not quite the Forest of Arden, but it's adjacent to, you can squint at it. There's a really lovely book, which you might be familiar with, which is J.B. Priestley's English Journey. So that's got a wonderful description of his visit to Snowshill, but he also has a bit of he waxes lyrical about the Cotswolds, and there's this wonderful quote that he describes it as "dream drowned in these green valleys." And that really sets the scene for the Cotswolds. It is a landscape full of fairy sightings, black dogs and ghosts. This is the wider mythological and folk context that Snowshill sits in. It's almost like the baseline to the song of Snowshill that you've got going on in the landscape here. Notable examples of this are the Rollright Stones. You're probably familiar with Long Compton that straddle the border of Warwickshire and Oxfordshire. Awful lot of poetic and legendary mythos around those particular stones. You've got the story of the Long Compton Witches and the murder of Anne Tennant by James Haywood in 1874. So that was only a few years before Wade's birth. So he's moving into a landscape. So when he comes here in 1920, he's moving into a landscape that has the residual hangover of these beliefs. These things are still going on. In fact, in 1934, I think it was, so 1928, a guy called Richard Clark, who had actually seen the murder of Anne Tennant, testified that the belief in Long Compton was still there, and he knows somebody who had seen somebody called Granny Faulkner turn herself into a hare and disappear down the chimney. So these are the beliefs that are still inherent, or are still part of the landscape when Wade moves in. So yeah, that is the overall context of the landscape that we've got here. Just moving on. So we move into the house now. I'm sure that you'll all be aware of some of the ghost stories associated with the house. So there's the story of Charles Marshall. I don't know if you're familiar with that one at all. So Charles Marshall was apparently, this comes from a book by Peter Underwood. Charles Marshall was one of the tenants before Wade, and his ghost apparently told one of his tenants where to find some gold to pay off a debt. So you've got that story associated with the house. You've got the famous monk who apparently scared one of the workmen from Evesham away. You've got a wonderful letter by one of the foremen called Lewin. I don't know if you're familiar with this letter. It's in the Evesham archives, but it's Lewin writing to Wade over the Christmas period in 1921. And Lewin, I'm assuming he's in Dragon by the sounds of things, because what he's describing sound as if it's the environment of the kitchen dragon. And he says in his letter to Wade, "I hear the subdued whisperings of the spirits which haunt the house, not wild hysterics or weeping as of souls in agony, but of a kind of a comfortable, contented sighs, and whispers as though the atmosphere in which they find themselves is congenial. The dining room, I think, is their favourite meeting place. The spirits that be, having issued from their general invitation to those that were, and in every shield in the dining room, I'm sure, has his occupant. I believe I have heard the bluff voice of King Hal, and ladies' voices. These must be his wives, who do not seem in their present existence to have any grudge against him for his past actions. In fact, they surround him in happy concord, no doubt the influence of the season," he's writing this Christmas, "upon their ghostly souls. It is a most stately crowd, and their conversations are sober and regal. That ribald jester, who laughs so much about the hidden treasure, is banished to the grey room. He is much too frivolous to be welcomed into the dining room, but he seems contented to, I'm glad. He seems contented to. I'm glad we have been able to give him such a comfortable atmosphere, and I flatter myself that it speaks of the success of our work in this old house." So I'm kind of imagining that Wade and Lewin have got this kind of this jovial relationship where they are talking about the spirits of the house to each other, and that letter just goes to show the depth of that joyous interaction. It's a really charming letter. You've also got the interaction. This is one of the really interesting things about Wade. You've got the spirit of Van Parsons, who is supposed to tread as the Grey Room, Is that right? Is that the right room? Andrew. So clues in the name, really, isn't it? So she treads Andrew, and that is all linked to the assemblage of objects that were found in the wall that Wade sent to a Brighton medium. I've not been able to trace the name of the medium. I've got a couple of names. We don't know how he was able to find this person or how he was introduced to them. But it just goes to show that there is a kind of soft interest that Wade has with the occult. So that should have been the first news that I should have started everything with. That Wade isn't a necromancer nor a magician. So that's the good news for a lot of you, because I imagine that some of you might have thought, what's he doing up there? It's all theatrical. Everything is theatrical with Wade. Although he has this genuine interest, enough to send an assemblage of objects off to Brighton to be looked at by a medium. So you've got that going on. So that's one link to his genuine interest, that he's willing to send all this stuff off. You've also got Bob Hodge's story. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Bob Hodge. So Bob Hodge was the gardener. He started in 1963. His father was the very long-term gardener who gardened for Wade for about 7 years, and was kicked out after having some not too polite words with Mrs. Wade. So I would love to have been a fly on the wall for that particular conversation. But no, his son came to work in 1963, and sometime between 63 and 65, I would have thought it would have been. He tells this story about he's out on a very misty, wet morning, and he comes across what he thinks is a dead pigeon on the floor in the courtyard. So that's just the door that leads up to the dragon, the kitchen. And he picks it up, and it's a doll. But considering it's a very damp, wet day, this doll's completely dry, and the window upstairs in would be Seventh Heaven is closed. That's where the majority of the toys and things were kept. So he doesn't know how this doll ended up here, but he takes one look at it, he says, I don't like this thing, and he burns it, which seems like a very, very dramatic thing to do, but in the context of some information that comes up later, I can see why he did it. So, but we'll come to that a little bit later. So you just bear the ugly little devil doll story in mind. And you've got, at this point in time, you've got a very interesting history. If you're interested in the history of Western esotericism, you've got an awful lot of interesting things happening. You've got the rise in spiritualism following World War I, and this may be one of the reasons that Wade was keen to take a punt on sending this stuff off to the medium in Brighton. You've also got, it's not the rise of theosophy. Theosophy's probably already had its day by this point and is in decline, but theosophy is a movement that kind of springs out of Blavatsky and the late 19th century. But there are practicing theosophists in the area. There's a fella called, what's his name? Geoffrey Hudson, who lived in Sheepscombe. He wrote a lot with a leading theosophist called Anne Besant, who was conversing with the angels of the land. So he was quite to the south of here doing his thing. He raised a temple to the elements in his property. So he was working with the land and the spirits of the land in that sense. But in popular culture, you've got people like Aleister Crowley and Gurdjieff appearing on the front of newspapers. Their practices and their very dramatised, what's the best word? Hijinks. Hijinks is very good. Aleister Crowley's Hijinks, episode 4. So you've got that happening in Europe. So I don't think Wade was a massive reader. I certainly don't think he was a tabloid reader either. But these are the things that he may have been aware of happening in the wider context of the 1920s. But you've also got, and Jenny pointed this out really wonderfully, are you familiar with the writing of John Masefield? Okay, so he lived down the road, and he's writing around this time, so you've got things like Box of Delights being inspired by this landscape, and maybe a lot of the characters that he meets around here, because we do know that, I'm pretty sure Jenny said that he has visited here, so that's a really wonderful link. So, but we'll bring it back to Snowshill now. So, okay, so I'm trying to be clever, having a bit of Latin. So, quod est superius et sicut quod inferius. So, as above, so below. This maxim is a very famous Hermetic maxim, and it will kind of come into sharp relief as we start to talk about the Garret a little bit. So, Wade's interest in the occult, I find astrology specifically. You find that a lot in the garden. So people who work in the garden, you'll have the what they call astrolabes? Armillary spheres. The armillary spheres, sorry. And you've also got the Nyctherian clock, which has a lot of zodiacal symbology on it. But you've also got something very, very personal. Wade has created his own, has had someone create a horoscope for him and has laid it out. And that's like, if you're involved in astrology, or that's an incredibly personal thing to have on display, because you can essentially interpret your past, present, and future through that information. And not much of it survives. You've only got 4/4 of it left now. It originally had the drawings for it, I believe, are in one of the outbuildings of Santa Maria Bio. So you can see what the original drawings were. And Wade I don't believe he drew this up himself. I think he had someone else do this for him. He wasn't a particularly bookish kind of person. And the information that is on that birth chart is incredibly specific. They use an awful lot of fixed stars, which is not something you'll find in a throwaway chart. There's an awful lot of very, very granular information on it, which is very interesting. So I would love to find out who made that. So if anybody's got information or has heard anything, please let me know, because that's one thing that I've always wanted to know a little bit more about. So you've got this interest in the heavens that is displayed outside, which is logically the best place for it. You've got that whole western vista. As you're going down the terraces, you're heading into that lovely valley that has the sun set over it. It's best place for it. So, talking about this Wade horoscope, transplantation of horoscope, it was originally designed to be in the Witches Garret. So the initial drawings for the Witches Garret, it wasn't called that at all. It was called the Alchemist's Den, which you might already know, and it shows a drawing of what I presume is Wade's plans to have his horoscope on the floor. And there's also plans for almost like a reclining chair that sits out of the very small window, or sits behind the very small window, which I imagine would be like a stargazing chair. But it doesn't make much sense to have that kind of thing up there, because you've only got a very small window on the western skies there. It's not very good. Another reason he changed the narrative of it is because the Alchemist's Den, there's not much alchemy going on in there. Like, you would need at least a very small fire going on there. If you've been in there, there's no airflow. You're very, very quickly going to gas yourself if you're trying to do any kind of alchemical operation in there. So the birth chart also has some inconsistencies and errors, but these may be stylistic. I believe that Wade was given the chart and then carved it, but added flourishes of his own on there to kind of make it, to beautify it for his own reasons. So moving into the house, these are my favourite things in the house. These two little dioramas that are in zenith. So these were made in 1921. So very early on, he's taking time out of what is a major building project to have some self-indulgent time making little dioramas and playing with models, essentially. I've never seen these in real life. I've never actually seen these open. I've only ever seen photos of them. So I'm hoping next time I come, I can badger one of you. Can you open the hatches for me so I can see? But essentially what you've got one panel that opens to reveal another panel which you then open again. I think there's 2 doors to them. Is that true? Right, okay. And one of them you've got an alchemist, and the other one you've got a necromancer. But this is the necromancer. You can't really see here, but he has a very similar haircut to Wade. He bears an uncanny resemblance. And whilst the necromancer, so the alchemist on the other panel, I think he's got a crystal ball. I think he's kind of like shuffling out. He looks like he's trying to beat a quick escape. This guy, he's quite happy. He's quite happy to see us. He's like, yeah, come on in. So yeah, 1921, he's doing these things as like little amusements. And I believe these are kind of like amuse-bouches. These are things that are going to be like, yeah, check this out. If you like this, you're going to really love what's upstairs. So there's that. There's also the tarot clock, which is in unicorn. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the tarot clock. Okay, so this is something that's really, really exciting. So the tarot clock is essentially 2 lines that display tarot cards from a deck, which is the Conver. It's a Marseille tarot deck, but it's a specific deck made by Nicholas Conver, or the workshop of Nicholas Conver. We don't know how Wade got hold of these cards. They certainly weren't in the book which he uses to inspire the Witches Garret later on. So we believe he may have been gifted these cards. He records having a set of cards in his inventory of the Garret in 1944, but what happened to these cards we don't know. So they are unfortunately lost, but they may well be these cards. There are a set of loot playing cards that are in possession of Snowshill, but these aren't traditionally used for divination. They are actually specific playing cards. So Wade has taken the Major Arcana from the tarot deck, which is images you'll recognise from things like James Bond, like the Death card and the Tarot card and the Lovers, and he's taken those and he's made essentially a 2 lines, and they mark out time on the clock. It's a drop clock, if I remember rightly. So as the weight falls, it tells what time it is. And this is in the room that was, I think, originally designed for Betty Murray, which was Elizabeth Murray? Elizabeth Murray's daughter to stay in. So goodness knows what it would have been like with that clock going off, because I think it originally rang the bell on St George outside. So yeah, goodness knows what that would have been like. I would have probably just taken it off to get some kit. But apparently the clock up in Top Galley has I've never heard it on, but apparently it's got a really lovely melodic sound to it. So if it was like that, we'll keep it on. So this is quite an undertaking. So he's not just taken the Conver Tarot, he's taken it, he's removed certain elements and added certain elements and moved things around. And we don't really know why. He's essentially mixed it up a little bit. None of the values that he ascribes to the cards bear any correspondence to any of the values that the Golden Dawn or other divination users would have been using at that point in time. So I'll do some examples of that in a second. So we'll just move on to any other points. Yeah, I'll move on to that in a second. The only contemporary link to the any kind of divination is in this one particular card, which I'll show you now. So on the left-hand side, your left, you've got the original Conver image of the Pepes. You've got the version that Wade did, and you can see how it's a composite between the Rider-Waite, the Rider-Waite Pamela Coleman Smith card here. So you can see he's taken the overall shape, but he's added the image of the moon, he's added the columns, but interestingly, he's taken out the lines from the book and has replaced it with this Torah. So, and you see that in the world card as well. It's a Torah Rotas, a Tor. It's a design which is repeated later on in the tarot. So he's getting some contemporary work from somewhere, but it's like he's saying, well, okay, I like that bit, but I'm not really into this particular design. We know Wade, he's quite romantic when he comes to, and quite traditional when it comes to his inspirations. Like he obviously prefers the look of the Conver deck to the more contemporary Rider-Waite. But there are some photos on the National Trust archives, so you can see what it looks like inside, and it really is magnificent. The images at the bottom are a little bit clearer because of damp at the top, but it's still a remarkable thing. So it just goes to show there is a deep level of engagement with this material. He's really enjoying utilising it for the visual impact that it has. Okay, so...
Could you just go back to that
yeah, of course, sorry.
The one on the right.
This one?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that also got Masonic regarding symbols?
Yeah, well, the Golden Dawn is heavily steeped in Masonic. It's essentially I'm not a massive Golden Dawn. I don't have a massive amount of knowledge about it, but the main thrust of it was very heavily Masonic. They did allow women in. It was basically a Masonic inspired, but taking on a lot of Egyptian themed kind of really not describing this very well. But no, there is a lot of Masonic stuff in here. The Golden Dawn was very heavily Masonic inspired.
The 2 columns in particular.
Yes, yeah. I can't remember what it's by Jacobin. Joachim, I think.
The entrance and the portway to
Yes,
Solomon's Temple.
Yes, that's it. But you've also got some really nice geomantic symbology here. With the pomegranates, they form the figure of Letitia as well. So there's an awful lot going on in there. But yeah, so and that's another thing. It surprises me that Wade was never involved with the Masons, considering how many architects and high up people that he knew. But it doesn't seem like the kind of club that he would have been into. He was very much his own person in that regard. Sorry, that's my homework for today. Learn a bit more about the Golden Dawn, or at least express it better. Okay, so we're going to look at the Witches Garret now. So the Garret was put together between 1934 and 1935. We know this is conjectural really. So when J.B. Priestley comes, he has a tour of the house. Wade takes him round, but he doesn't take him into the garret. So I don't think he was ready at that point, because in 1935, I think it was 1935. Where are you, Virginia Woolf? Yes, so 1935, that's when you get the Virginia Woolf anecdote come by. So, and that's when Wade is really, really leaning into this space as somewhere to play, essentially. So, as discussed previously, it was originally called the Alchemist's Den. It changed mainly to fit the space a little better. The Witches Garret is a lot more elastic in terms of its narrative capability. You're able to kind of put things that are... He fills it with several objects that kind of really, really epitomise the witchy aesthetic, if you want to express it like that. The rest of it is kind of detritus, which gets linked to it by proxy. He's using this book predominantly. So this isn't the edition he would have been using, but there's a copy of this in the office if anybody wanted to. It's not this particular version, but there is a copy of this text and it has all the images in it if anybody wanted to look at it. But you can pick this up on any good bookshop or second-hand bookshop for about £10–15. It's not an expensive book. And this was written by a guy called de Givry, who was a French author. It was published in English in 1930, so Wade got it very, very early on. It's obviously, as soon as he's got it, it's like, oh wait, this book's full of really, really cool stuff, and I'm going to use a lot of the imagery from it. So,
what's the book called?
It's called Sorcery, Magic and Alchemy by Emile Grilot de Givry. And there's a couple of examples which I'll show you in there, where he's just wholesale taken the imagery from. So as soon as you go into the garret, you kind of stoop under. On the wall behind you, you've got this wonderful image of an atlas holding the zodiacal sphere. And this was probably painted, it's flanked by the male and female mandrakes and some other smaller images as well. This is probably painted by Eileen Heenan Cosmati, who was married to Aldo Cosmati. So if you know him, he was very famous for doing a lot of the London Underground posters in the 1930s and 40s. But she also did some sculpture. I believe there's a Green Man spigot that's in the garden that she did as well. I think we have got some actual evidence that she did do it, but also looking at it, stylistically it's quite different to Wade's work. It's quite a heavy line. The lettering is very different, and it's different to the lettering that's in the image, so I think that she's taken that and she's done that herself. So it's a collaborative, so the Witches Garret is a collaborative project. He's involving people that he knows are going to be quite handy at doing this kind of thing. However, the circle on the floor is, I believe, 100% Wade, and it is completely unique. It is something that is very, like the Snowshill Tarot, which is a unique tarot set. I still believe that if the National Trust was to produce that tarot set, it would be one of the best-selling products in the shop. That would sell out very quickly, I can guarantee. And like the tarot, the circle on the floor is completely unique. I've got some images that will be on the next slide that we'll look at in a second. What he's doing with the circle, he's taking images from this book and he's making a composite image. He's taken images from planetary seals, planetary talismans. He's taken imagery from more than one magical circle. But what he's also done, he's changed the seals. He's changed which are essentially the names of the angels, or one of the angels that are in the circle. I believe this is possibly done because I think there's a soft kind of superstition. We already know that Wade is sending things to mediums. We already know that he's got things like horseshoes in the house. You know, it's kind of like it's soft superstition. We also know he's got spirit bottles in the house, which I don't know if you've seen these. These are the bottles that are in Admiral. They are glass bottles that are filled with threads, and this is traditionally seen in, you've seen this, they're embedded in walls sometimes, apotropaic materials that are designed to kind of calm ghostly activity down. We don't know if he did this after the stories of the monk. If he's losing work, and maybe he thinks, I could try one of these and put it up somewhere. He's hedging his bets, I think, essentially. I don't think he's buying into this wholesale, but I think he's definitely hedging his bets, and he's playing with it in a very like loving way. But with the seals, he's changed them, so I think he's kind of almost disarming the circle. Even though if somebody who knew a little bit about this might look and say, right, okay, that Michael sigil, that's in the wrong place, that should be in the south, because you go in, the Michael sigil is actually on the west of the circle, because snails are these wonderful like this. As you go in, you've got north, south, west and east. Like, you always know where you're in the house, which is brilliant. Even the names of the rooms are in the landscapes. You've got Zenith and Nadir at the south and the north of the house, which is really useful. So as you go into the Witches Garret, you know pretty much where you are directional wise. So he's changed these things around. I believe he's done this as part of, he's disarming it somewhat. I think he's hedging his bets a little bit. So the last point on this slide is that as you go in, if you were to take some of the objects out of this, if you were to get rid of the paintings, the floor paintings, the wondrous candle, which is now at Boss Castle, the flipper of glory, which is now in Admiral. If you were to get rid of those objects, maybe the skulls, so I get rid of the skulls. If you were to get rid of those objects, it would essentially just look like an attic. It wouldn't look particularly magical. But these are the objects which kind of tune that setting. They give it that heightened sense of theatrical magic. You walk in there and you see a hand of glory, what looks to be a hand of glory. These paintings there's something going on here. This is a wonderful set, or someone's doing something in here. So it's these things that kind of tune that particular choir. What was there something I wanted to say about that? I think I've lost it now. That's it. Yeah, so these objects, they are kind of they're the objects that pass on the contagion of magic. They have an atmosphere around them that pass that on. So that is why I think when Wade passed away 9 years later, when the trust don't know what to do with them, they go up in there and they think, we don't know what to do with this. So that's one of the reasons why I think it was these objects, without the context of Wade, that it became something that was not what it was. Right. So we'll have a look at these circles now. So this is Wade's drawing. This is what you find when you go into the Witches Garret. And you can see where he's taken these various elements from. So you've got the hair at the top, the Sade, the Mikael, and the Yod. He's based it off this circle here. You can see the outline. He's just added bits that he wanted to. He's made it his own. And that's what he does. He's a magpie like that. So we'll move on. So yeah, so what was Wade doing? What was he doing? Like, so what is a necromancer to begin with? Because this was something that he did adopt. This was a persona that he had, which I will go on to that in a second. So a necromancer is it comes from the Greek necromanteia, which means to deal with the dead. And you get early references from the Odyssey, where I believe it is Odysseus raises the ghost of Tiresias, I think, in order to ask him about something. But you also got it biblically, the witch Vendor gets, is it Saul who raises Samuel to speak, I think, to ask him about the outcome of a battle, which doesn't go well. In the Western magical context, and you see it in this, if you go back, we've got an awful lot of names of God going on here. This is very, very Christian. In the Western magical context, necromancy, more often than not, you are appealing to the power and the authority of God to grant you the authority over other spirits, to raise them from the dead, in order to commune with them. So it's not essentially that diabolical in one way, because you're kind of sidestepping that, thinking, right, if I get God's authority to do this, it's okay. But Wade the Necromancer, he's dealing with something else that's dying. He's dealing with the dying of, or the death of a whole way of life, the death of crafts, the death of the pre-mass manufactured things. He's dealing with the time and the effort spent with material. There are several references to people coming to Manor and talking about him being an eccentric and whatnot. One of the ones I really like is a quote, I can't remember who this is from, but it's from a J.M. Barrie play. They compare him to a character called Lob, who is rather like Puck had he grown, what Puck had grown into if he had forgotten to die. And I really like that. I think that's a really nice way to approach Wade. I don't know if you're familiar with any of Wade's poetry, especially his later poetry. Some of it, sorry Wade, isn't very good. It's very saccharine. It's very it's a bit wet. It's not very meaty. But if you look at his later poems, especially around 1951, when you got the transfer of the house over to the National Trust, he's writing predominantly about magic and the occult. He's writing about things that I believe. I genuinely believe that this subject, these themes, he finds like a home in. We know that one of the very first objects that he bought that ends up in the garret was a picture of Mother Shipton. He bought that in 1900, so he was like 16, 17 when he bought that. That's now on display at the Museum of Witchcraft. But how many PLE 16-year-olds are buying prints of Mother Shipton and knowing what it is? You know, you really have to link that back to the very first object that he bought, the reliquary. He has a fascination with not just the language of the occult, but the language of religion. Like you go around the house, you see a lot of religious iconography. You see like St. George outside, you've got Santa Maria Bird, you've got the collection of reliquaries. He really, really loves this particular theme, and I believe that the occult or magic is just an extension of that for him. So anyway, there's these poems that he writes, and he specifically writes a couple that have this character called Sylvanus of Thuringia, who is an alchemist who passes away in a terrible alchemical operation. But I don't know if he developed this character at this point in time, or if he was actually calling himself Sylvanus of Thuringia when he was up in the garret. It might have been something he lent into. So, but also poetically, he's not drawing upon things that he might have drawn on, like things like Dr. John Dee, Edward Kelly. He doesn't reference these characters at all. He doesn't reference anything to do with contemporary occultism. So he's taking it from the early modern period. He's taking it from imagery from books like this. He always said that he learnt more from images than he did from books. And I truly believe that is the case here. He's taking what these images are telling him and putting his own spin on it. We do know that he owned an awful lot of occult adjacent books, and when I say occult adjacent, these are kind of more like metaphysical Christian philosophy books. I believe he bought these mainly because of the bindings and what they look like. Most of them were thrown away by the trust in 1960s because they were just so damaged that they couldn't do anything with them. But I've got a list of them if anybody wants to know what they were. But there are some. I think he had a 15th century edition of what was it? It'll come to me in about 10 minutes time. But he had some very old books that sadly were thrown away. But yeah, just to emphasise, it's theatre. This is all theatre. This is a persona that he is embodying and he is loving. To emphasise this, we get the Virginia Woolf visit, the very, very famous quote. So yeah, here he is, dressed up like a cavalier. I don't know if he's a cavalier. I think with those boots, he's a cavalier. Those wonderful Brazilian boots. So the quote from the Virginia Woolf visit comes from her friend Susan Buchan, who actually drove her here. I think she got a train back, or she tried to get a train back separately. But Mr. Wade was reputed to have many magical secrets and was called the Necromancer. Mr. Wade wore his hair long. Of course he did. He's amazing. And led us to his laboratory. And I saw Virginia's eyes gleam when she looked at the stuffed crocodile. So at that point, he does actually list having a stuffed crocodile in the eaves. So he's probably seen, there's some very famous images of cabinets of curiosity. There's I think it's a guy in late Renaissance Florence who kind of came up with the very first cabinet of curiosities. And it's this room basically just festooned with hanging alligators and things like that. So he's leaning into that tradition of the Wunderkammer. But you've also got this quote from James Lee Milne, who is a very Marmite kind of guy. He's very acerbic. So Wade's humour was, to put it mildly, sardonic. He richly enjoyed taking advantage of his visitors' distraction while he conducted them round the house, and observed he would disappear behind a tapestry into a secret passage to re-emerge beside them several minutes later in an upstairs room, having changed into 18th century robes, and resume his conversation as though nothing had happened. Brilliant. Or he might leap with streaming hair through the flames of a blazing fire and land at their feet. So he's loving this. Like, Wade's the kind of person who wants you to come to him. If he likes you, that is. Like, if he finds you interesting, you're coming in, you're getting the whole tour, and I'm going to dress up for you. I don't know if there will be anybody like Wade ever again, in this sense, who is able to invite people. Because at this point, like, you do see the house being advertised in various local papers for people to come and visit. And he is encouraging people to come, and I think there is a charge. I haven't actually found much about that. But he's inviting people into his house. It's full of his cool stuff. Like, he wants people to enjoy this with him. It's kind of like, you know, when you're a kid and you have like your favourite auntie or uncle come over. It's like, come up to my room, I want to show you my stuff. There's that energy, there's that momentum about it. So, and yeah, going back to local papers. So after 1951, when the house became open to the trust, or taken over by the trust rather, we've got the Evesham local Evesham newspaper saying talking about the rooms in the house, and they mention specifically the Witches Garret. They mention a room full of early, I think they say early modern or medieval witchcraft material. So the room was open. The room, people would go up there, and it was obviously a different time. You can't have people up there now because the ladder is pretty rickety. Like, as brave as I am going around, I did not enjoy going on that ladder. I'm coming down it today. But people were going up there. We've got anecdotal evidence that, from letters that are sent to the Museum of Witchcraft from people who visited the house in the early 50s that were going up there, having a look round, and then coming back a few years later and being told, no, there's nothing up there, there's never been nothing up there. So there's a narrative change around this time, and we're going to have a look at that narrative change. So after Wade passes away in 1956, you lose his physical presence in the house, and you'll all be aware that he is a larger-than-life character. Like, his presence, especially to a room as specific as the Witches Garret, is essential. Without it, it becomes unmoored. He's the anchor to that particular room. He gives that room the meaning that it requires. Without it, it drifts off into the shadows, essentially. And in a wider context, you kind of see why that happens. So in the 1940s, you've got in the local area, this is all fairly close by, within about 45 miles, you've got the case of Bella and the Witch Elm, which I don't know if you know about. So that's your homework for tonight. So in 1943, I believe it was, there was a skeleton discovered in the epicormic growth of a witch elm tree in Hagley Woods, I think it was. It was Hagley Woods. And there was a lot of kind of mystery attached to the skeleton. There's the stories of her being a German spy that parachuted in and died in the tree. There's stories about her being a ritual killing to procure a hand for a hand of glory. There's all sorts of various competing stories about that. But essentially, there was the skeleton of a woman found in the tree, Hagley Woods, which has a whole mythos about it. And there's a really wonderful, about a year or two afterwards, all this graffiti appeared in Birmingham and in local areas saying who put Bella in the witch elm. So there's an awful lot of drama around that. So that's a really interesting thing for you to look into if you're not familiar. You've also got the very famous 1945 ritual murder of Charles Walton, which you might be aware of, Neon Hill. So Charles Walton was a agricultural worker who was found pinned down into the ground with his own pitchfork on Valentine's Day 1945 with ritualistic markings on him. He was I think the cross was carved into him and some other bits and pieces as well. That caused a real furore. I think it was Fabian of the Yard was drawn into that one. There was an awful lot of drama around that because they never found out who did it. And the whole community essentially locked down. Nobody spoke about it. But you also have an awful lot of things come into that where Charles Walton was reputedly a cunning man who had a certain crystal that he was keeping safe for someone that he didn't want to give back, and that was one of the reasons he may have been killed. But you get stories about him as a child having seen a headless black dog or a headless woman in the local area, and him. So there's an awful lot going on with that as well. So the folkloric and the factual are never too far away from these stories, and they definitely cross over and blur. In the 1950s, you've also got the rise of neo-paganism. You've got Gerald Gardner's Wicca movement, which is rapidly gaining pace at this point in time. You've also got an increasing popularity of Dennis Wheatley. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dennis Wheatley. Devil Rides Out, To the Devil a Daughter. Charles Gray plays the baddie in Devil Rides Out. He's very good in that. And you've also got what is his name? Who plays Duke? Lee. Goodness, Hammer Horror. What's his name? Christopher Lee. Yeah, you've got Christopher Lee in it. You can't go wrong with the film with Christopher Lee in it. There is, again, Christopher Lee, Hammer Horror. So you've got the rise of these things in popular culture. You've also got a really interesting anecdote of a ghost hunting tour that took place at Snowshill in the 1950s as well. So, from what I can recall from this story, there was a group of lads from Evesham who went to a technical college there. They took recording equipment and made audio recordings in the house, and that were then sent to the BBC. Apparently, there were a lot of photos taken of this ghost hunt as well, but I've not been able to find any more information on it because sadly the only link I got to it is from an email that was sent in 1997 that's archived at the Museum of Witchcraft, and none of the emails work anymore. It's been an absolute nightmare trying to track that one down, but imagine if you had photos of a ghost hunt, or even the audio recordings from a ghost hunt at Snowshill Manor. I imagine it probably would have been a lot less dramatic than things like Most Haunted. I think it would have been a little bit more subdued. So you've got these things going on whilst Wade's passed away. So these are the things that kind of make people look at the Garret in a very different way. They change its meaning somewhat. Without Wade there, it doesn't have the same charm. It loses its kind of whimsical patina and becomes something quite, well, as Cecil Williamson describes, especially dangerous. So Williamson is asked to come to the manor in 1965, and I believe he came twice. So the first time he came was to look at the Garret, and we know this because he took a series of drawings. He made, like Wade's inventory, he made little notes, little drawings of things that he found interesting. So he takes notes of the paintings, the wall paintings, of the floor paintings. He makes diagrams of the wondrous candle, which he will later take. Makes diagrams of the Hand of Glory, which he deduces very quickly is not human. So he doesn't take that, but he does take a few items. I think it's about 18 items, if I remember rightly. So he's not taking everything wholesale, he's only taking the things that he wants. And he then displays them in his museum, which is then at Bolton on the Water. And the unusual thing is, he always said in later interviews that he never put any of the stuff on show. He never did it. It wasn't something he was interested in. But he did. We found object labels in the collection that date back to Bolton on the Water, which actually celebrate these items as having come from Snowshill and say, you should visit Snowshill. It's a really interesting place full of really interesting things up the road. So that's in 1965. Williamson had already bought Boscastle in 1961 and was in the process of moving things down. He wound up the Museum of Witchcraft in Bolton on the Water between 1965 and 1966. We know it wasn't there in 66. And I believe it was around this time that he wrote the letter, which I don't know if this is the letter that gets quoted. I don't know if you're familiar with this. So essentially what he does, he writes to Snowshill, because originally this was all above the board. We've got letters from Lee Mill and Mr. Crossfield, who was the curator at the time, saying absolutely fine for Williamson to have these objects on loan, absolutely fine, it's all above board. We then get this letter crop up that says, I need to take all these objects and burn them on a specific night on Meon Hill, which we've already mentioned, because they belong to an especially dangerous black magician. I believe Williamson did this in order to kind of say, yeah, these objects, these are mine now, I'm taking these. It was a sneaky way of taking the objects away from Snowshill, essentially. Williamson, like an awful lot of folk, a lot of collectors at that point in time, and all museum collectors have been, if you look back further in history, and you only have to look at the British Museum now, you know, it's not exactly always an ethical transfer of goods. It's not an unusual thing to find in historically practiced. It's something that does happen. So Williamson takes these objects and he then displays them under different names. It's only in the 1980s that one of the curators, I believe it was the guy who wrote Days for, or compiled Days Far Away, whose name escapes me now. Jessup, thank you very much. Michael Jessup, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, Michael Jessup. I believe it was him that came across the items, and he told a historian called Professor Ronald Hutton about these items. I found these items. You want to go and check them out? And when Ronald Hutton comes, because he's doing research on the subject of new paganism, he finds these objects and says, yeah. And he also discovers this letter as well. He finds this letter that says these things are especially dangerous. Sadly, this letter is at the moment untraceable. I know at least 2 people who have seen it in the past, but at the moment it's not. I don't know where it is at the moment. Through an awful lot of chasing, I've not been able to find it. So this is the one thing that's still the stone in my shoe. This is the thing that I've not been able to find. But we know it exists and it's been accounted for by at least 2 or 3, at least 3 like professional historians. So we know it exists.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
Do you think that the Trust was trying to disassociate themselves from these objects by letting them go on loan?
A little
in the
bit.
first instance?
Yeah, because you've got these reasons. You've got these reasons. I think it was something that they realised very soon on. You can't have people going up and down there. It's not very safe. You don't know what they're doing in there. You can't imagine having a volunteer in there, like just opening the hatch all the time. You'd have RSI very, very quickly. I think there is a sidestep into disassociation. I think it's something that wasn't particularly palatable at the time. I think it's a shame, but you don't. It's very hard to step outside that particular context and say this is what we should have done. There are people that they're a product of their time. They're a product of these particular social occurrences. So to conclude, just to go back to that original statement, mystery is most valuable in design. There is nothing more mysterious in the world than what happens outside the boundaries of the physical, or the material. I genuinely believe Wade was fascinated by magic, fascinated by the material culture of magic and religion as well. We know he wasn't particularly religious. We know he hated weddings quite vigorously, but he's playing with these subjects. He's making that they are his sandpit essentially. It doesn't mean that they are throwaway things to him though. He's treating them extremely sincerely. He really does enjoy playing with these things, and he puts his toys away nicely afterwards. These are things that he cares about. So the use of occult image and language is used to deepen the intrigue of specific rooms and features essentially. These are kind of Wade's soft explorations into astrology and apotropaic even folk and customs. There is something really wonderful in the Witches Garret which I've not mentioned, which I don't know if you're familiar with. They're colloquially known as witch marks. These could be like VVs or daisy wheels that are carved into stone in certain places or wood in certain places. If you go into the garret, if you walk along into the middle of the room and look at the purlin beam on your right hand side, it's the eastern purlin beam, you will see a VV. Now we know that it's not a post-Reformation, it's far too late to be a post-Reformation kind of apotropaic symbol. But it's also Wade's initial, and I believe, and it looks more like a W than a VV. With Wade's explorations of houses in East Anglia when he was working for Bishop, he would have gone around to quite a lot of old properties. He would have seen like the burn marks. He would have seen these daisy wheel. He would have been familiar with the practices. Like he would have known what that was. And I think he's kind of like the magic circle. He's seen it and he's kind of made his own twist on it. So that's a wonderful little bit of apotropaic play. And just to reiterate, these things were an endlessly playful resource for him to draw upon. And if you look at it askance, like these things, they're not particularly unusual. Like if you go to any other national trust, you'll go and you'll see classical statues in gardens and things like that. It's not very far removed from that. Like he's just doing that in a more parochial manner. He's doing it with the material that he has the things that he finds classically inspiring. He's drawing upon his background in kind of the arts and crafts movement, which looked towards the pre-Raphaelite inspiration of things that came before Raphael. Like he's drawing upon these medieval imageries and inspirations. So I said that we start with some good news and some bad news, and I don't think it's bad news, but the bad news is that if you are in the house and you are passionately talking about Wade, you are essentially his body and his words in the house you're all necromancers. You are all practicing what he did in that sense. You are all following in that tradition. And I don't think it's a cloak that should sit uneasily on your shoulders. I think it's something that you should wear with a bit of flair, because it is a wonderful thing to celebrate. And the work that you do, contextualising this, is doing Wade's work. It really is. And I personally can't thank you enough for it, because I think it is a wonderful thing to do. And in regards to the Witches Garret, I know that there might be some, because it's such the experience of dealing with the occult, especially magical practice, is a very subjective one. It's very much, you can compare it to religious practice. It's a very, very subjective thing. It feels difficult to talk about it in that sense, but if you frame it in the sense that what we know Wade was doing with it, he was using it as a means to be theatrical and to play with these subjects, it takes the discomfort away a little bit, I believe. We know that, you know, I think he came from a long line of, I mean, you've got, what's his name? What's the author? Dark and Stormy Night. He wrote Vril, The Coming of, oh goodness. He was related to Wade back, you know the guy I'm talking about. But he would have known about these characters. He would have known, like, he would have been told stories as a kid. He's just leaning into that. Like, that's essentially what he's doing. And I don't think the Garret should be any scarier or more difficult to deal with than, say, Zenith or Top Galley or Admiral or Dragon. They are all occupying the same level in terms of the capacity to inspire. The only difference is that, you know, it's kind of been made a little bit redundant now because it isn't accessible to visitors, and its story post-Wade gets incredibly serpentine and labyrinthian, which is a talk for another time. And again, that's Williamson. You know, his actions weren't particularly above board, but what he did with some of the objects was actually quite remarkable in their own way. They go on from Snowshill, from being theatrical items or being theatrical props, to actually becoming quasi-magical items, because those things, they then go on to inspire other people with their own magical practices. You see people copying Wade's work and using it for their own magical practices. So in a way, you know, Wade is a catalyst to some of these things. He was never going to know about it, but he certainly had a hand in them. And on that note, we'll close. So thank you so much for your participation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And any questions?